Maniga Samjanya Pabama Tame Zasa Satao de Kama Shuma Bone Shuma Lodinia Pilla Bonu Sure di Pavana Karane Ubatana Kara Dwesapiro Da Pioge Vale Dine Eri Jane Samjanya Pabama Nyasapia Nyonjaro Mutare Shumapo Dari Sepiro Piopivame.
Yesterday, Sayadaw discussed the instructions in the section on clear knowing, Sampajanya Pabba, for mindfulness of eating and drinking. Today, we will continue discussing the rest of the instructions given for mindfulness practice for clear knowing in this section on clear knowing, Sampajanya Pabba. Yesterday, Sayadaw used the method of explaining both the way of going about being mindful of the processes of eating and drinking, so the bhavanakara, the method of being mindful, method of practice, and then also the way that insights arise while one is being mindful of these activities, that is the upatanakara. So integrating these two methods, the Sayadaw discussed yesterday, and today we will continue to discuss this section on clear knowing with the rest of the instructions.
Erot Shumabo, Pari Shumaya Melu Sura, Sepiro Meshitavangaro. Kate chite nitene nisene sokte jagrite pasite toni bawi samjanakari hoti solo yingaro miro toare khama da doriari di ma pho ba be now yanni de khama le yanni de kha phit paw la de doriari di ma pho ba be Tiny Kamaleve to do it, tiny Kaitan people at the Rodiari. Now, ain't it a Kamaleve, aim of your machimboli, da ain't it the only Muyago, the Tabido, Shumanu, a Biodore Chingaro, da Shumalu, Mayaro Wow. Now, Aria Aya Nibido, no labia no leve, Jagrita Core, Jagrita, no Jala, no Ladi, no Lelu, Tabio, Mayari, no man at the Yari. Didn't I never read Habido, Shumayari. Now, Miro Sagabiore Kamale, the Malusiao, Arima, Sagabiore Kamale, the Habido, Pioal. Sagabio, did they say Nire Kamale, did they say Nire a capipolade, the Odiarigo, Dadri Habido, Mayamelu, Damyasavia, Yajaro.
The way that the Buddha continued these instructions for clear knowing was Gate, Tite, Sutte, Chakrite, Basite, Tunibute, Tunibawe, Sampajana, Karihoti. So, this means that in going, when one is going, that one makes oneself clearly knowing and mindful. Likewise, when one is stopped and standing, one makes oneself clearly mindful of this. When one lies down and is getting ready to go to sleep, one makes oneself mindful of this whole process of, as one lies down and goes to sleep, keeping the mindfulness going thoroughly until the last moment. Of course, when one is fully asleep, one can't practice mindfulness, but up to that point, one keeps the mindfulness going, one keeps this clear knowing going. And then as soon as one wakes up, one should know that one is awake. One should start the mindfulness up again, start noting whatever is arising. So this is making oneself clearly aware in the being awake. Furthermore, when one is speaking, it's important to keep the mindfulness of speaking all the processes, mental and physical, involved in speaking. And finally, when one is maintaining silence, here too, one is to make oneself clearly aware.
Nabido Sangati Patta Jiradharani Samjana Karyoti Sangati Sara Koreano Myama Nezong Dengan Tongde Siabare Dengan Tongde Suragaro Di Dengama Di Nalawatapiro Choksabiro Tare Dengan Shibare Elau Dukko Dengan Kobare Dukko Sa Duketa Duketa Sa Nalawatapiro Chokta Natat Dengan Boli Amalu Yorishino I Natat Dengan Kore Sangati Sa Shibare Nabido Iku Abo Goma Yung Yambiro Tare Dengan Shire Elau Ikasilu Kobare Now Kama Watare Dengan Shire Era Demene Kobare Eri Dengan Dongde Nezo Yandomia Shiabare I Dengan Dongde Ma Dinatas Dengan Yidu Suragaro Dua Ireka Chungtalu Yabare Now the Yashima de Kama do legal copiro Kimbiro Time biro Ni time shine don't biro da don't biro Yabare the Yamalu Yabare who she got Yalegaro Diroboli Dore down in my Dobito the Yatu Jaro Nia Tangin Dilu Koni Sini Bay Shimale Nishiro Nina Machine de Conate your divided soup bow Biro Aribo and Biro Cona Natating and you legal copiro legal copiro I will Kimbiro Tainave Kuyogian Tiny Sofare Doma Kongma I'm I've got the divided in sort of your eating. Hello, time you don't worry about it.
So the next instruction is Sangita Pata Chivaradharane Sampajana Karihoti. Sangati Pata Chivaradharane Sampajana Karihoti. So as monks, we are required to always have at least 3 robes. So the outer robe is this sangati, this 2-layer robe. So it's a robe that is made of 2 layers of cloth sewn together, many strips of cloth sewn together in 2 layers. So it's fairly thick and warm. And this is called the double layer cloth, the sangati. So this sangati can be used for many things. One, first of all, there's three major robes. So this outer robe, the 2-layer robe, sangati, and then the upper robe, ekasi, and then the lower robe. So the outer robe is used to keep oneself warm. If one needs a shawl, one can wrap oneself with this 2-layer outer robe, sangati. And also, if one needs something to sit on, one can fold it in 4 and have a nice sitting cushion. So in the days of the Buddha, of course, the monks went off to sit in the mountains and in the forest, so they didn't have these sort of zafus along with them, these sort of very cushy big pillows. So they folded these outer robes in 4 and took leaves to put down under put a pile of leaves down and then put this folded cloth on top and had a very nice cushion. Sayadaw says probably about as good as these as you have. So very nice and soft. So that one can use one's outer robe for these purposes.
Hello, Natatanganyigo. A don't beauty a car, a don't beauty and we are the Shivare. The one Natatanganyi, Kauta and the piano machine, piano, mapoli, piano, mulari, Ariani Biro Guvoma Chune, Shilushin Chune Muyari Ritapiro Mabo. Ariani Biro, he came to time Lucineve Arima Kautaru, the Kinaru Sure, the Muyari Ritapiro Shumabubabe.
So, when one is making use of this 2-layer outer robe, there's all sorts of actions involved. So if one is spreading out the outer robe, or if one is folding it and wrapping it around oneself as a shawl, or if one is folding it up and putting it down to sit on, in all of these cases, there's many little actions, many movements and actions involved in this process. So the instruction here is to be mindful, to be aware of all of these actions.
The check bang go ma go point the young widow tare, Gonya go nire kajaro, Bakong the pepper of your body, lay a bit. Congo ma, the packet in Biro, hello, what time? Hello, young net capacity, hello, what they come up, you see, young net muyali shide, what they muyali shide, chone muyali shide, eralile, 3 tapiro, shumayabare. Now call the good car, they didn't say that cavalry, muyari miajibo. Now they may car would do let to do ave, car would need a muyali with 3 tapiro, shumayare. Tajao, Miriet, Dengamia, the what they young at Kamalebe, Yasopiaga, the Tilumba solo, the Diluma Piao, da, and they say Macanita Pipale.
Likewise, with the upper robe that we are wearing now, when we wear it formally like this, it goes across both shoulders. When we're in our own rooms, in our own monastery area, the monks wear it uncovering one shoulder, the right shoulder covering the other shoulder. So whether one is wearing it, putting it on in a formal way, or putting it on in a less formal way over one shoulder, however one is making use of the robes, there are all sorts of actions and such involved in this process, so one is to be mindful of all of these. And likewise, when one washes and hangs out and so on, this upper robe, then there are all sorts of actions that one is to maintain mindfulness of. And furthermore, when one is putting on one's lower robe, wrapping around oneself, this too is to be an object of mindfulness. So it was because the Buddha was afraid that we would not be mindful, that we forget to be mindful. It was in order for us not to forget to be mindful of all of these processes that the Buddha gave this specific instruction to maintain mindfulness in making use of these robes.
Now, patta sura, the Sayadaw deka, don't be quite bad. Oh, Yano Myanjaro, the bay look coraboli. Eddie, the bay sure, the quago, Miro, Yano Mya, the Sayadaw ne Kamaleve, Sayadaw de Kamaleve, don't be. Now, the Garabari Sima, Wabiro, Swankane Kamaleve, the bay neve, Wabiro, Swankane. Ariani Pianare. Go John Job de Kama Pisi, Domho Eawada Gomiro, Yiru Baru Bizum in Yama Pisi, Yara Taimiro, Pomidons of Yalababe. I do Pomidons on the Kama, Kona the bait Sire Muyari Shire, the Bago own net dog de Muyari Shire, now the bay 8, the bait Tere Muyari Shire, the bay 8, the Bago told you that Muyari Shire. Ariani let him at a bipiro, the Murayarema, Sungan Vare Kama. The Garamari got so long Lucian Eve, Arima, the Wipong Poinaro, Lambiro, Canyuraro, the Bapong Baitaro, Sashire. Thì xong khăn này chạy mà lấy về thì tập về của cái đời tông ta này khám mà mua nhà đi mua xí bà đấy, cái mua nhà lâu đài nhà sập nhà cái tết đi một lối vào số bị đó, miền Nam tết đi tháp bị đó, xíu mà khai tháp đấy.
Next is the pata. Pata refers to the vessel with which we eat and drink. So, for monks, the vessel that we use to eat and drink with is the alms bowl. So there are all sorts of actions involved with this alms bowl. When a monk goes to eat and drink, he uses this alms bowl. Or when one goes in town to receive food, one takes this alms bowl to receive food. And when one comes back, either back to the monastery or at a suitable place, one eats from this alms bowl. And then if there's finding a place where there's water, one washes the alms bowl. And so many different actions involved in using it. So all of these actions are to be objects of mindfulness. When one is taking the bowl out and holding it, and when one is getting ready to go on alms round, when one is carrying it on alms round, when one is receiving food, the mindfulness of lifting up the top and of accepting the food and carrying it, and when one is returning, then the processes of eating from it and the process of washing it and putting it back, and so on. So there are many different processes to be mindful of in using the alms bowl, and it was in order that we not forget to be mindful of these processes that the Buddha gave these specific instructions to maintain continuous mindfulness of all of the actions making use of this alms bowl.
Hello, Johnny. The other day, come out, don't hope. Go in my way, people body, those are there come out. Middle, the what's in it, the water sheet of it, the water, the water beauty come out. Tali Amuya, Shuma Pobabe, Uma, in you water, the middle, Kona, any Bianchoda, any Dana Kauda, the Muyali report. Today, my channel, Chomyan, Chomya Muyali report. Now, cow, the bound new, now it don't need what they come a lebe, that what they Amuyali body. Taligo, the Dimolo on. The Tabido, Labido, Shumapo, Pimare.
So that's instructions given by the Buddha for the monks, for the ordained renunciates. But as lay people too, whether you are on retreat or back at home, you make use of clothes and cloth. You wear clothes. So all of the actions involved in making use of these clothes are to be objects of mindfulness. So for instance, putting on your shirt, or taking it off and folding it and washing it and so on. Or likewise, whether you're wearing pants or skirt or putting on a shawl or because it's cool. Whenever you're using clothes and cloth, then all of these actions are to be noted carefully. One is to be carefully mindful of all of these actions.
The Nandong Devashire, what they own a cale, they be up, get at them a miabu boli. So I do show you a chong like that. Yan like that, you like that, cow dale, color that. I'm not they be up. Massia date, meow. To the Lu Johnny Jaro, Massia de mia. Massia mia and Bobby or the Ayabu Kong. Boundless rock. Be below any, a mumu one in ave, the Tatiana view. Doing a bounty or doing any the carp water, the cat tabby or whoopia, not a cat tabby or whoopia. ဘုံယုံနဲ့မပြီးသေးဘူးနော်ကျဲသည်တက်ရတာနဲ့ကျိတ်တွဲရတာနဲ့စစ်ဆွဲရတာနဲ့အလုပ်တွေကိုအများကြီးပဲနော်ဒီထဲမှာခုနကတော့အလှမပြင်သေးလို့အလှပြင်လို့ရှိရင်ပိုးပြီးတော့အလုပ်ရှုပ်သွားတယ်အဲ့တော့ဒီလူဝတ်ကြောင့်နေကြတော့တကယ်သာတတိထားပြီးတော့မှတ်မယ်ဆိုရင်ဒီအဝတ်ထဲတွေဒီဝတ်နေတဲ့အမူအရာတိုင်းမှတ်ရင်တို့ရဟန်းတော်တွေပို့ပြီးတော့အမှတ်များများမှတ်ရတဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်တို့လူကြောင့်နေပို့ပြီးတော့အသိဉာဏ်တူတွေဖြစ်လိမ့်မယ်လို့ကိုယ်တို့ထင်တယ်အဲ့ဒါကြိုးစားပြီးတော့တို့ယောဂီများတတိထားပြီးတော့အဲ့ဒါမှတ်ကြည့်ပေါ့နော်
So Sayadaw has a thought on this issue. For monks, it's actually, there's not too much involved in this process of using our cloth, our clothes. You know, just these 3 robes, and when we wear them, when we put them on, it's pretty simple. We just either put them, fold the lower robe and wrap it around ourselves, and then put on the upper robe, whether it's in formal robes like this, or just throw it over one shoulder. Really not a lot involved, quite a simple process. So there's not too much really to note in the process. Not too many actions to note, to be mindful of. On the other hand, lay people have many different clothes, and so all sorts of things they have to do with the clothes. So it's not just, one layer of clothing on top and bottom, but also inner garments, and then outer garments, and then sometimes another layer on top of that, a sweater or whatever. And then it's not, one just doesn't put them on, one has to button them and zipper them and do hooks and all sorts of things like this. So that's just putting on the clothes. If one wants to make them look good, that's even more. So many things involved, quite a lot of work involved in putting on lay clothes. So many different actions to be noted, many different actions to be mindful of. Many more objects of mindfulness, much more to be mindful of. So Sayadaw thinks that if the yogis are really mindful of all these processes, for the monks, there's not so much to note, so there's only a certain amount of insight that we can develop in this putting on the robes process. But as lay people, if you really pay attention to all these processes, it seems like it would be much easier for you to gain deep insight in this process. So, Sayadaw thought about it that way. The lay people have much more to do, and much more complicated in terms of this particular instruction of being mindful of putting on clothes and so on. So they have much more opportunity to gain insight in this particular area.
အဲ့တော့ဒီခုနအဝတ်တာချင်းတူပေမဲ့တို့ယောဂီတွေလိုအကြောင်းတွေကအဝတ်တဲ့အခါမှာပို့ပြီးတော့အချိန်များများယူရတယ်ပြီးတော့အမူအရာတွေလည်းပဲအများကြီးပြုလုပ်ရတယ်ဆိုတော့အဲ့ဒီတတိမလွတ်အောင်လားရှုမှတ်ကြမယ်ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်တော့ဒီလိုအဝတ်စားဝတ်နေရင်ကိုမိတို့တွေမညံဖွညာတောင်းရလောက်လိမ့်မယ်လို့ထင်တာပေါ့လေစိတ်ထဲမှာတော့ဘာလို့ဆိုတကယ်ရှုမှတ်လို့ရှိရင်နော်ဝိညာဉ်တိုင်းဝိညာဉ်ပြုရင်ပြင်းရင်ဆင်ရင်ကနေပြီးတော့ဒါကြသွားနိုင်တော့ပါတယ်ဒါကြောင့်ဒီမိတို့မှာကခုနဒီအဝတ်ဝတ်တဲ့အခါမှာဒီလောက်ထိအောင်ဒီအလုံးများနေပြီမယ်လို့မိတို့မှာတတိမလွတ်စေရအမြဲတမ်းတတိထားပြီးတော့ရှုမှတ်လို့ရှိရင်ဒါအကျိုးရှိနိုင်တယ်ဆိုတာလေးသိအောင်ပြောတာပါ
So just as the monks are to be mindful in the process of using all our robes, making use of our robes, so too the lay yogis are to be mindful of all the processes involved in putting on their clothes. But since there's much more involved in putting on lay clothes, it actually takes a good deal more time. One has to put in a good deal more time, and also there's many more actions involved in the process. So Sayadaw thinks that if the yogis really were to apply totally continuous mindfulness without missing any moments of noting, that they could gain very deep insight, that they have the opportunity to gain path and fruition right in the putting on of the clothes. So we should all be practicing this mindfulness while we are making use of our garments. And what Sayadaw really wants to get across is that this is an opportunity to practice mindfulness, that it's something that we shouldn't miss, that we shouldn't miss this opportunity to practice mindfulness and gain insight.
Now, Lord John in it, gonna start it, began quite out so like she was. And he started began quite out to start the quit them about Hindom Yusuye, Goshima, began don't long see navy, started quite at the low. Now, hang a mula solution of began a mula body, 8 Macona. The pay left out on the paper gang at Talayadi, the tema coffee laid out in a coffee gang Talaya. The tema conna, you knew John Yoko. As a web of Jerusalem, Kare, the Quadia choking in our Hamiabe. Edo, the Quadigo, Hona, Gayara, Doyara. Nabido, Hingue Mialushi, Hingue Digo, see all. Who are the sergeant, one land Nalia, the Ali sergeant of Lanalia. Animatroli, Kesara Doromia, Sayadaw. I got a gabba quite out the Sam Tabi de Kaja Leve, say the Jode, a look at Sariga, Chia Yane. Daria, the began quite young Yamia body, that middle of the way, that don't sound like Kama, a few moody, a Miari. I love you, Moody, a few moody, Malebe, Tamido, the dilemma on body, that lady, Amena, Shuma Pido, that Sato Pibare.
So as lay people in the eating and drinking as well, you've got lots of vessels to use. So not just one vessel, but you might have your bowl or plate, and then also if you've got 5 different kinds of food, you have a bowl for each of these. And if you've got tea, you've got a teacup. If you've got coffee, a coffee cup, and so on. Many, many different vessels. So there's a lot of different actions that go into this process of eating, of using these vessels. The more vessels one has, the more cups and bowls and plates and so on, the more actions are involved in using them. So one takes the food and scoops it and puts it on one's plate. And then if one wants a different kind of food, one has to, there's the reaching and the taking that bowl and the scooping and placing, and then the one from over there and the one from over here, and many different vessels. So one scoops from here and scoops from there and puts on one's plate. So many different actions involved just in the eating process in terms of making use of the vessels. And then that's not all. Once you're done eating, then there's the whole washing process and so on. So many different actions, many different opportunities to be mindful in this process. So this is all, these are all opportunities to practice mindfulness that are not to be missed.
Tini Niginga Sansarole, Diloe, Poji, Chima, Yausuka, Great Valley. Vincent Chepio Biro, Vincent Hare. Henny, so ever my chat. In the only way, they are going to do your body, so near a body, a jewelry your body, Daddy G. Oh, Daddy Yaji. Now, Daddy has sent out there, come on, Kona, who are nice alike, the Ali nice alike. Salalu, nice idea solution, look at the Yadorave. Now, I can't move over at lunch like the Uri, quite deep, Yaji, I appear, me was all in the Kuwe. Daddy G. Oh, Sally, Asasa, Savoya, the Testali at the Lautia. The Alogan de Miavala, the Alok Shopala, the Toka Miavala, Sadawa, the Toka, and the Gapo in Zion. Mini, to Yogi Dali, the retire. Also, the Ashuma de Kama, Bamunchin, Paya Kisabori, Yamba Kisa, Nenemia, Nea, Ne only way, Miro, Savia. Elo Nema, Miro de Ashuma de Kama, a Chimiamia Yabiro, Kia, Shumanina, Chibari. Taja, Wanza, the good on the Kawabuya, and do it, the Tassa Saya de Tokalidi. Me only way, Dalidi, the Tabiro, Shumayamare.
as we were eating lunch today in the monks' quarters, Sayadaw looked at all of the dishes that Greg, our cook and great supporter and attendant, had put out on the table. And so, first of all, Sayadaw looked at all the different bowls, this dish and this dish and this dish and dessert and so on, and all of the tea and many different bowls and cups and so on. And so Sayadaw was thinking to himself, "Wow, look at all this work, to use. One wants to take this, try this one, and try that one, and try that one, and try that one. Look at all the actions that one has to do." And then Sayadaw looked over towards the kitchen, where Usuka had all sorts of pots and pans and everything all spread out, filling the kitchen, a little kitchenette area. And Sayadaw thought to himself, it's so much work just to eat once, just for one meal. So much dukkha involved just in preparing this one meal. So the yogis also should look to be seeing this kind of dukkha. When a yogi practices, they try to keep, they give up their outer work and so on to come practice intensively, and they try to make their duties as little as possible so that they can gain as much time as possible to practice and therefore travel along their journey. So as one is practicing in this way, making one's activities less and less, trying to keep one's activities to a minimum, one can also pay attention to these processes, seeing how tiring and how much suffering there is involved just in what it takes to eat even once.
Yeah, that's what I got to get the video. The big quit alone, Kaisa Pina. I'm a Judin Tiari Hoget, the Judin Samoyari Hotara Chivare, Uma Patabain Judin Sura, Pata Pinda. The big quit, the Kudigoda, Sakwepsin, the Dhamma Satao Damu. Now, Ikatane, Judin Slashide, Ikasanika Sura, Atata, Masavene, the Tatene, the Tainene, Dinde Awa, Satao Damiri Boli. Akona Biodrobo, Natasa Lucia, Natasa, Chea Pioya Luya Kaya, Lurijado Natado Macau, and Yanizam, Rashidi, Adonda Salam Ship, Aludia Bobiro, Miano, Sadao de Lumiana, Saudo, Chavia, Pocuri, Lumiana, Lagisam Yanelushi, the Atopuyasra, a chinting name to me. Tamyasopia, do you have the video? A little case that Mamia on Subiro. And that I know she, Ikatane to Din Saudija, Ikasane to Din Sura, the Tatetania, the Shinema, that Pompitons of Nava, Tawa on Sara body. Now, Badawa in Suraga or Kona, the way to the quite the Kure mana. Go to many or Henny or Golung Tebiro, your bit of Mubiro, Sari the Boba, your no bit of Sari the Boba, that Badawa in the Kore. Erilo, Sara, da, Sayadaw in a Patepiro, Lokisari, Nedware. Because I am sees ya Maloro, the way the long sea line and beat out a little about it. Now, Ponule, the Sakaima, Nizen Karunga, the Boli Kulu, the Arakuro, the Bienba, the Diaskani, Dola, and the Yaluraba. The Kojango Vanide Camaro, the Cardia, and Lubo, the only the body, if you see, what any Masui, Ikasani do, the Barabainu, the Sayabare. Elusare Nema, Toro look. Netware, it's a long time netware. I chain my conaco, the Analontan level chain in Yadware, or Tayamas of Yaga. Tayahanorigo, or Yakudo. The Adama Bomia Atopoya to a chain Yamia Yao. It's that ne out. The little Macy Dorabe, season Dorabe, Supido, Payacole Lumda, Genu Liza Mide, Payashin, Yonjaramuri, Diamond Lena Lucy, Damidu Rima, a Jewish name. A job, me to recoup your arrow. What does Sarah, the location of the Patapiro, Kesa, Nedamian Neo. ဒါကိစ္စကိုခြုံပြီးတော့မိတို့တရားနှလုံးသွင်းတဲ့အချိန်တွေကိုအများကြီးရအောင်ဒါကြိုးစားဖို့ပါပဲခုဒီထဲမှာယောဂီတူဆိုတော့ရှိရင်ဧကစနိတ်တူတင်နဲ့ပါရပိုင်တူတင်ဆောင်းပြီးတော့စားနေတာကိုတွေ့ရတော့ဘုန်းကြီးအထူးပဲဝမ်းမြောက်မှုဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒါတို့ခေါ်ပြီးပါတယ်
So if the yogis are paying attention to this process, to all that is involved in making use of vessels and so on, and washing them and so on, they can see that it's a great deal of work even to eat just one meal. So this is why the Buddha encouraged his followers, encouraged his students, that if they were able to undertake certain extra ascetic practices as dutangas, such as the patapenda, no? Patapenda dutanga, which means eating just from one vessel, eating just from one's bowl, just from one bowl. So if one eats just what is put in the one bowl, in the one vessel, then this makes for a lot less work, a lot less having to do stuff in terms of when one is using it to eat, and then also especially when one is having to wash it and clean up. The amount that one has to do, one's actions go less and less. And another one is the ekasana dutenga. Ekasanika dutenga, a practice of only eating once a day, basically, of eating only when one sits in one place until one is satisfied and full, and then not eating again. So not getting up and coming back and eating more, but just sitting one time, eating as much as one needs for that day, and then that's the end of it. So by practicing in this way, one can see that the amount of work is much, much less. So even the amount of work involved in just eating once is a great deal of work. So one makes it less by just eating once, one makes it less by just using one vessel. So much more work if one uses a number of vessels, cups and bowls and so on. Double the work, double the things to do if one eats twice a day. Never mind as lay people, it may not be not even twice a day, but 3 times a day. So lots and lots of work. So if there's all this to do, all these actions that one has to take care of, tasks one has to take care of, one can see that the amount of time one has to practice, to meditate, is less and less and less. Very little. So that's why the Buddha encouraged his followers, if they were able to undertake these extra practices, these dutengas, such as the eating once in one sitting, eating at one sitting, and the eating from one bowl, because they make the amount of work less and less, so one has more and more time to practice. So if the yogis try this out, they will notice that this is true. Sayadaw as well, not when he's off on teaching trips and so on, but sometimes when he has the opportunity, either on a Sabbath day, Uposatha day, or during the rains retreat and so on, if he has the opportunity, sometimes he has the opportunity to eat like this just once a day or just from the alms bowl. So he's seen for himself how much less work this is, how much more ease there is with this. And when he's practicing in this way, he not only really appreciates these practices, but really finds himself very inspired by the fact that the Buddha encouraged these practices, and really understanding why the Buddha would encourage these kinds of practices, to make more and more time for meditation practice, less and less tasks that one had to do, and really finds him very inspired by the Buddha, with a great deal of faith in the Buddha and so on. So it's true, when one makes one task less and less in this way, one has more and more time to practice. So there's actually one yogi here who decided to undertake these sort of practices while this person is practicing. And so Sayadaw finds himself really glad about this, and really finds himself calling out sadhu and so on. So very glad to see somebody practicing like this.
အဲ့တော့ခုယောဂီများအများစုပေါပြီးတော့အထုတ်နေတဲ့အခါမှာခွေးလိုနဲ့တကွအဲ့ဒီလိုပဲတစ်ထက်ထဲစားပြီးတော့တစ်ခွက်ထဲနဲ့ဒါစားရင်မကောင်းဘူးလားလို့မေးကြတော့ရှိတယ်အဲ့လိုမျိုးတော့မိတို့မှာတစ်ထက်ထဲစားလို့မိတို့ရဲ့ခန္ဓာကိုယ်မှာညတာမှုရှိမရှိဒါလေးလည်းပဲရှင်းကြရတယ်ဆိုကြပါစို့ခုဘုန်းကြီးတို့စိတ်ဒီတရားဟောရတယ်တရားစေရတယ်သွားလာလှုပ်ရှားရတယ်ဆိုတော့ဒါခန္ဓာကိုယ်မှာအင်အားသုံးရတဲ့အခါမှာတော့ဒါမိတို့အစားတောက်ကိုဒီတစ်ထက်ထဲစားရုံနဲ့ဒါတင်းတယ်မဟုတ်ပါဘူးအကယ်၍ကိုယ်တရားလေးရှုမှတ်ပြီးတော့နေတဲ့ဆိုရုံလေးလောက်ဆိုရင်တော့ကိစ္စမရှိပါဘူးခုနဝေယဝဆာတွေလုပ်ရမယ်၊ကြံရမယ်၊ဆောင်းရမယ်၊လှုပ်ရှားရမယ်ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်တော့တစ်ထက်ထဲနဲ့တော့ဒါမပြီးနိုင်ပါဘူးအဲ့လိုအာယုံအတွက်ညာကနေပြီးတော့ညစာမစားတဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်မနေ့မှစားလောင်လာမယ်အချို့ဆိုကြလို့ရှိရင်အလိုမတန်သိတာပါတယ်ဘုရားလည်းပဲအလိုမတန်သိတာပါတယ်စားနေကြမနေ့မစားလို့ရှိရင်လူဟာကရုံကရင်ဖြစ်လာတယ်တုံလှုပ်ဖြစ်လာတယ်ရှင်ဒီပါးတွေတုံးလာတာဖြစ်တတ်ပါတယ်မိရဲ့ဒီကျမကြီးထိခိုက်နေစရာအကြောင်းရှိတယ်အဲ့တော့မနေ့မှဒီအာဟာရဖြစ်အောင်ဆိုပြီးတော့တက်စားလေးစားရရတယ်တခါနေခင်တခါစားရတယ်ညနေတော့ဘာမှမစားဘဲနဲ့နေလို့ရပြန်တယ်အဲဒီမှာအဲ့တော့ဆိုလိုတာကတော့ခုနယောဂီတွေအနေနဲ့တစ်ထပ်ထဲနဲ့စားပြီးတော့အဖရိုရဆိုတာလည်းပဲခုနပြောသလိုမျိုးတရားရှိမှတ်တဲ့နေရာမှာနည်းနည်းအခက်အခဲရှိမဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်တထပ်ထဲစားလို့မဖြစ်ဘူးဒါဖြင့်တစ်ခွက်ထဲနဲ့စားလို့ရမလားဆိုတော့အဲ့ဒါလည်းပဲတခါတခါအများနဲ့ကြတော့အခက်အခဲရှိတယ်ဒီမှာတော့ပူဖွေးဆိုလာရှိပါတယ်ဒီခွက်တစ်ခုထဲမှာမျိုးကြိုက်တဲ့ဟင်းတွေအကုန်လုံးစုပုံပြီးတော့ထည့်စားတဲ့တချို့ဆိုင်တွေပါရှိတယ်ပေါ့လေအဲ့ဒီလိုစားဖို့ရာတစ်ခွက်ထဲနဲ့ပတ်တပိုင်အနေနဲ့စားဖို့ရာစီစဉ်ကြည့်ပြန်ဆိုခဲ့လို့ရှိရင်လည်းပဲဒါလေးပဲတိတ်တော့မလွယ်ကူတဲ့အလုပ်တစ်ခုဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒါဘုန်းကြီးနဲ့ဒါလက်တွေ့စမ်းကြည့်ဖို့ပါတယ်
So when one considers in this way, there's of course the question, well, would it be good or not for me as a yogi to practice in this way, just eating once or just using one vessel? But one needs to consider the needs of one's body and what's appropriate and so on. So for instance, for the Sayadaw right now, he's having to carry out various tasks. He does interviews in the morning and does talks at night and various things that he has to take care of. So he's having to expend bodily energy. So when one is expending bodily energy in this way, then it wouldn't be enough. It wouldn't be sufficient if he were just to eat the once. So, and that's why he takes a small meal in the morning as well as the before noon meal. So that's why sometimes it is necessary to take not just once but twice to take food if one is having to expend bodily energy. So likewise, if one is really having to do a lot of work, whatever kind of work retreat or various things, if one is really having to expend a lot of energy, then it really may not be appropriate to just eat once a day. One may not have the energy to keep going. If a yogi is not having to do a lot of work but is just practicing all day, then it should be fine. It shouldn't hurt one's health to try just eating once a day. And so likewise with the only eating from so also one may find that one is hungry in the evening. And so by the morning time, if one's having to expend energy, then one may find that one is hungry in the evening. And by morning time, that the stomach is growling and all sorts of gas and things, so it can actually cause problems in the digestive system and become a disturbance to one's health. So in these sorts of cases, it's important, it's necessary to not just eat once, but to eat a morning meal as well as the noon meal. So in these cases, one has to look at the situation to assess whether it's appropriate or not. Likewise, with the eating just from one bowl, just from one vessel. So since the yogis here eat from a buffet, take their food from a buffet, one puts all one's food takes whatever food one needs. And so if one is having to put all one's food into one bowl, that may cause some difficulties. So that might cause some difficulties.
October ကျောင်းပေးရက်လေးပါလေးမှာပေါ့လေဟိုနွေရာသီကျတော့ဘုန်းကြီးကျောင်းမှာတော်လေးများပါတယ်၄-6ပါလောက်ရှိတာပါ၄-5လောက်ရှိတယ်အဲ့လိုဒီယောဂီနေတဲ့အချိန်မှာဘုန်းကြီးဧကသတိပေါ့လေဧကစနစ်ယောဂီတွေကိုတစ်ထပ်ဒါစားစေပြီးတော့တစ်ထပ်သာကျွေးပြီးတော့ဘုန်းကြီးရှုမှတ်ခံကြည့်တယ်ယောဂီတွေတကယ်ကြတော့မမှတ်နိုင်အမထုတ်နိုင်ကြဘူး2ရက်3ရက်အစားဆိုရှင်ယောဂီတွေမျက်နှာလေးညှိုးနေတာပဲခါလေးကြည့်ရတာနောက်တော့အချိန်လေးရတာတော့နောက်ရက်တွေတော့သိတော့မဆိုးပါဘူး။နောက်နေ့တွေကျတော့အဲ့ဒီမှာဧကသနိကျွေးမှလားဆိုတာမေးတယ်။ဘာလို့လဲ။ဧကသနိဆိုရအမထုတ်နိုင်တော့ဘူးဗျာ။အဲ့လိုပြောကြတယ်။အဲ့ဒါနဲ့မဖြစ်သေးဘူးအများနဲ့ဆိုလို့ရှိရင်တော့ဒါဧကသနိအဲ့မှာဘုန်းကြီးရက်လိုက်ရတယ်။နောက်ပြီးတော့ဒီဘူဖေးဘောမျိုးနဲ့ပေါ့လေ။အဲ့ဒီလိုတစ်ခွက်ထဲနဲ့မိတို့ယောဂီတွေခိုင်းပြီးတော့ခေါင်းကိုကြက်ရဟင်းကိုထည့်စားတဲ့အဲ့ဒီနီးမျိုးလည်းပဲဘုရားကြားစွာကြောင်းမှာကိုပြပယောဂီတရားစခန်းမှာ1999ခုနှစ်ကဘုန်းကြီးအဲ့ဒီလိုကျွေးဥပါတယ်ဒါယောဂီများလည်းဒီပကံခွဲရောက်တစ်ခွက်ထဲနဲ့ပြီးအောင်ခေါင်းဝေယဝဆလုပ်တဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တွေလည်းပဲခေါင်းဟင်းထဲတဲ့ဇလုံးခွက်လောက်ပဲဆေးရအောင်ပေါ့လေကိစ္စနဲ့လည်းနေအောင်ဆိုပြီးတော့ဘုန်းကြီးအဲ့ဒီမှာကျွေးကြည့်တယ်ကျွေးကြည့်တော့အဲ့မှာဘာခက်ခဲတွေတွေ့လဲလို့ဆိုတော့ဘုန်းကြီးတို့ဒီတတ်လို့ယောဂီတွေအတွက်တပန့်ပေါ့လေဒီတတ်လို့မဟုတ်တဲ့ယောဂီတွေအတွက်တပန့်ဆိုဟင်းကခွဲတော့ချက်ထားတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့လို့ဒီတတ်လို့မဟုတ်တဲ့ယောဂီတွေကတတ်လို့ဟင်းလဲထည့်စားတာပဲခုနတတ်မလို့တာလည်းပဲသူကထည့်စားတာပဲဆိုတော့ဟိုတတ်လို့စားမဲ့ယောဂီတွေအတွက်ဟင်းကမကြံတော့ဒုက္ခဖြစ်သွားတခါတည်းစားပြန်တော့လည်းပဲဟင်းကဟိုတင်းလျော်လျော်လောက်ပေါ့လေကိုမျှတရုံလောက်တယ်မဟုတ်ဘဲနဲ့တချို့ကြတော့တခါတည်းအများကြီးခတ်ပြီးတော့ယူပြီးတော့ထည့်သွားတာတွေရှိတော့အဲ့ဒီမှာဟင်းနေပါတွေကမလောက်မငါတွေဖြစ်သွားတယ်အဲ့လိုမျိုးတွေဒုက္ခတွေ့ရတယ်ဒါအများနဲ့ကြတော့အဲ့ဒါတွေတော့ခက်တယ်တချို့ဟိုတိတက်လေကိစ္စမရှိဘူးဘုန်းကြီးတို့ဒီဘောဇနေမတ်တင်ညူတာဆိုတဲ့ဒီဘုရားရှင်ရဲ့ဒီဟောကြားထားတာတွေရှိပါတယ်စားရတော့တဲ့အခါမှာဒီအစားတောက်ကိုအတိုင်းရှိနေသိပြီးတော့စားရမယ်ဆိုပြီးတော့ဒါမြတ်စွာဘုရားကညွှန်ကြားထားတာရှိပါတယ်သို့တော်လည်းခုနလိုကြောင်းနေနေဆိုတာကတော့မိတို့အစာနဲ့ပတ်သက်ပြီးတော့ခုနစာမပြုမှာစားဆိုတယ်မတင်တိမ်မှာဆိုတော့ခုနဟင်းနေပါလိမ့်မယ်ကိုလုံလောက်ယုံနေနေမဟုတ်ဘဲနဲ့အပူရှန်နေထည့်ပြီးတော့စားရမယ်ရှိတဲ့အခါကျတော့ဒီအများနဲ့အဲ့ဒီလိုဘူဖေးလုပ်ပြီးတော့ကျွေးရတာမျိုးဧကသနိပါရပိုင်ကျွေးရတာမျိုးပါရပိုင်ပေါ့လေတစ်ခွက်ထဲနဲ့ကျွေးရတာမျိုးဆိုတာအခက်ခဲတွေ့ရတတ်ပါတယ်ဒါကြောင့်အဲ့ဒီအခက်ခဲတွေကြောင့်ခုနဧကသနိပါရပိုင်ဟာကောင်းတော့ကောင်းပါတယ်ဒါပေမဲ့လို့အများနဲ့ကြတော့သိပြီးတော့အဆင်မပြေဘူးဒါကြောင့်မလို့ဒါခုစာရုပ်စားစဉ်အတိုင်းပဲဒါမျိုးစားပြီးတော့ဒီစားတဲ့အခါမှာပြုလုပ်တဲ့အခါမှာအမှတ်မလုပ်အောင်မကြိုးစားပြီးတော့မှတ်ဖို့ပဲလိုအပ်ပါတယ်
So especially when it's a whole group, there difficulties can arise if one tries to have the whole group maintain these practices, like just eating once or eating from one vessel. One time Sayadaw tried this out at his monastery. It was a time when there weren't so many yogis, like 40 or 50 yogis. Actually, during the hot season, there's a certain retreat that has many, many yogis, hundreds of yogis. But at this time, there was only a few yogis, 40 or 50. So Sayadaw decided to try out this practice of just eating once. So he just had the meal served once a day. And so what he found was that the first day, people really had a lot of trouble. They were hungry. And then they weren't really able to practice very well. The next day, people started to get pale and weak. And the third day, people started to leave because they said, Sayadaw, we can't practice anymore like this. So Sayadaw's experience is that while it's good for certain individuals that one can't just have everybody, the whole group, practice just eating once a day. And another issue with that, and then also with just eating from one vessel, is that if you serve people buffet style, so Sayadaw did this actually when the very first foreign yogi retreat at Chaswa, in 97, Sayadaw had buffet lines, and of course there was dishes that some dishes had meat and some dishes were purely vegetarian. And so in order to make less work for the people working at the retreat, for the people in the kitchen and so on, having to clean the bowls and plates and so on, Sayadaw had the yogis just use one vessel in order to make less work for the people working and washing and so on. But what he found was that when people went through the line, that the people who did eat meat took meat, and they also took vegetable dishes. And the people who didn't eat meat were left with very little vegetarian food. So when people have to eat just once, or when people are eating just from one bowl, it's really important to be moderate, because often there's a fear that one won't get enough. There's a fear that one won't be satisfied. So one piles on, and means that there's very little left for people behind one. So if one really has this moderation, knowing of the moderation or matanyu, then it's no problem. But as lay people, people were not used to eating in moderation so much, not used to eating just once or twice a day, and so they would take more and more because they were afraid that they would be hungry, and that would cause problems because the people behind them didn't have anything left to take. So Sayadaw's experience is that having everybody at a retreat do just eat once, or have everybody at the retreat try to use just one vessel causes difficulties. But in any case, the important thing, the main thing is that however one decides to practice, whatever is appropriate, whether one does decide to eat 2 meals or use multiple vessels, then the most important thing is that the yogis maintain this mindfulness of all the actions involved in the process.
အဲ့တော့အဲ့ပထမနှစ်မှာဘုန်းကြီးအဲ့လိုဘူဖေးတော့နဲ့ကြွေခဲ့ပါတယ်အဲ့တစ်နှစ်လုံးတော့အဲ့တစ်နှစ်အဲ့တော့တလားစခန်းနဲ့တူတယ်နော်အဲ့တော့တလားဆုံးဘုန်းကြီးအဲ့ဒီဘူဖေးပဲကြွေပါတယ်ပို့ပြီးတော့လုံလောက်အောင်ပို့ပြီးများချက်ပေးရပါတယ် ဒါလုံလောက်ပြီးတော့အလုံးတော့ချမ်းချမ်းသာသာနဲ့တော့ပြီးသွားတာပဲအဲဆိုလိုတာကတော့အဲ့လိုဒီတယောက်နှစ်ယောက်မဟုတ်ဘဲနဲ့ဒီအများစုနဲ့ပေါ့လေဒီလိုဧကတနိစာရာမျိုးဟိုပရပိုင်စာရာမျိုးဆိုတာကတော့တော်လေးခရင်ပါတယ်ဒါကြောင့်ဒီစားရတောက်တဲ့အခါမှာကိစ္စနေတဲ့လည်းများနေအောင်ဟင်းလည်းပဲအများကြီးမဟုတ်ဘဲနဲ့တစ်ခွက်ကောင်းပေါ့လေခုဒီမှာတော့အတော်လေးဟိုဆင်ပြေပါတယ်စားကြတောက်ကြတာတွေကတိတ်ပြီးတော့များများစားစားမဟုတ်ပါဘူးသူတင်းတင်းရုံလောက်ပဲအဲ့လိုတစ်ခွက်နှစ်ခွက်လောက်ပဲစီစဉ်ထားတော့ယောဂီတွေလည်းပဲစားတော့တာတင်းတင်းမှုရှိကြမှာပါအဲ့တော့မိတို့ယောဂီများအနေနဲ့ကတော့ကိုယ်တတိပေးလို့တာကတော့စားတဲ့တောက်တဲ့ခါမှာအဲ့ဒီခုနဘလောက်ပဲခုနကိစ္စများနေပေမဲ့လို့ဒီများတဲ့ကိစ္စတိုင်းမှာပြုတ်တဲ့အမူအရာတိုင်းတတိ limits တွေပဲနဲ့မနေ့ကတော့ရှုမှတ်တဲ့နည်းအတိုင်းပေါ့လေအဲ့လိုရှုမှတ်ပြီးတော့ဝါများအထုတ်သွားမယ်ဆိုကြလို့ရှိရင်ဒီဓမင်းစားတော့သုံးဆောင်နေတဲ့အခါမှာလည်းပဲရိုးရတန်တာမှာသမာဓိတွေဖြစ်လို့အသိဉာဏ်တွေရလို့ဒါဉာဏ်စဉ်တွေစဉ်တက်ပြီးတော့ဒါမျိုးတို့အကျိုးရှိကြမှာပါအဲတော့မြတ်စွာဘုရားကတော့ဒီမိတို့ပြုမှုနေတဲ့အပြုမှုတိုင်းဒီလောက်ကင်နေတဲ့များကာလပတ်လုံးဒီအမှန်တရားတွေသိဖို့ရအတွက်အစစရရတတိထားကြပါလို့ဆိုတာကိုသိစေလို့တဲ့အတွက်ကြောင့်ဒါယခုလိုမြတ်စွာဘုရားကရှုမှတ်နည်းတွေဟောတော်တာဖြစ်ပါတယ်ဒါအရှုမှတ်နည်းတိုင်းမိတို့တွေလိုက်နာကျင့်သုံးသွားဖို့ပါပဲ
So at that first retreat in 97, the only solution was just to keep cooking more and more and more until it was enough that even though the yogis were taking quite a lot of food, that nobody at the end of the line was left without food. So for that whole retreat, the cooks had to cook more and more and more because the yogis were afraid of being hungry. So Sayadaw's experience is that it really doesn't work so well. There's really a number of difficulties that arise when you try to have a whole retreat, do these just eating once or eating from one vessel. It's okay with one or two people or so on like that, small numbers, but the whole retreat really trying to do that causes difficulties, is Sayadaw's experience. So in any case, the important thing here is understanding that one tries to make one's tasks as few as possible. With whatever tasks one does have, with all of the actions that are necessary, one finds necessary involved in eating, using one's vessels and cups and bowls and so on, and washing them and so on. All of the actions that one finds necessary to do these, to take care of these tasks, all of this dukkha that one sees in taking care of these things, that one really pays careful, mindful attention to all of the actions that are involved. By noting carefully, by bringing this continuous mindfulness in, then the yogis can see the nature of these mental and physical phenomena and how their conditionality and so on, and develop the levels of insight deeper and deeper. So Sayadaw would like to remind the yogis to really bring in this mindfulness continuously and thoroughly in all of these processes that are necessary, in all of the tasks that you have, all of the actions. In this way, you can not miss this opportunity to develop insight. In this way, you develop more and more concentration and deepen your insight more and more.
အဲ့တော့မြတ်စွာဘုရားကဘယ်အထိဒီမှတ်ခိုင်းလို့ဆိုခဲ့လို့ရှိရင်နောက်ဆုံးကုန်ပြောကြဆိုလေဒီဥက္ကြရပစ္ဆဝကမေသံဇနာကာဟောတိကျင်ကြီးစွန့်တဲ့နေရာကျင်ငယ်စွန့်တဲ့နေရာမှာတော့မှအသိဉာဏ်ဖြစ်ပါစေတဲ့အသိဉာဏ်ဖြစ်အောင်တတိဆုစိုက်ပြီးတော့ရှုမှတ်ကြပါအဲ့တော့ဒီတိုင်းလက်ကိစ္စဆောင်ရွက်နေတဲ့အခါမှာလဲယောဂီများဒါတတိမလွတ်စေရဘူးအဲ့ဒါတတိရှုမှတ်ရမယ်ဘယ်နည်းပဲရှုရမယ်ရှုမှတ်ရမယ်ဆိုတော့တ ဒါပြောလို့တော့ခက်သားပဲဒါယောဂီများမှတ်တတ်တယ်လို့မှတ်ကြပေါ့ဒါကိုပြီးတော့တိုင်းလက်သုံးဆောင်နေတဲ့အသုံးပြုနေတဲ့အခါမှာကိုယ့်ရဲ့ပြုမှုနေတဲ့အမူအရာတိုင်းကိုဒါသတိထားပြီးတော့မှတ်ဖို့ဒါမြတ်စွာဘုရားကအမိန့်ရှိတာပါအဲ့တော့မြတ်စွာဘုရားဟာခေါဏမိမိတို့ဒီပြင်ပမှာပြုနေတဲ့အမူအရာတွေမဟုတ်ပါဘူးခေါဏကျင်ကြီးစွန့်နဲ့ကျင်ငယ်စွန့်တဲ့နေရာမှာတော့မှမိတို့အသိဉာဏ်ဖြစ်အောင်သတိထားမှတ်လို့ဆိုကြတဲ့ကိုကဒါမိတို့ဘာမှမမှတ်ရတဲ့တရားဆိုတာမရှိဘူးမမှတ်ရတဲ့ကိုယ်မူရနှုတ်မူရစိတ်ကိုယ်စဉ်းစားဆိုတာမရှိဘူးအကုန်လုံးတတိမလွတ်အောင်ရှုမှတ်ဖို့ရာဒါမြတ်စွာဘုရားသတိပေးတော်မူခဲ့ပါတယ်ဒါကြောင့်အမြဲတမ်းအပမဒိနာဘိကွေသံပါဒိထအဲจิตသားတို့ယဟန်တို့တင်တို့မိမိရဲ့ပုဂ္ဂိုလ်တဏ္ဍနဲ့ဘယ်တော့မှမနေနဲ့အမြဲတမ်းသတိတရားနဲ့နေကြလို့ဆိုတာနေရှိသမျှအချင်းရှိသမျှဘုရားရှင်ပြိဋိဘံသံတော်မူကာနိအထိသတိပေးတော်ပါတယ်ဒါကြောင့်မိတို့တွေဒီပြုမှုတဲ့ကိုယ်မူရာတိုင်းနှုတ်မူရာတိုင်းစိတ်ကူးစဉ်းစားကြံစည်တိုင်းဒါတတိလက်မလွတ်စေပဲနဲ့ဒါအထူးပဲကြက်မှတ်ပြီးတော့ကြောင်းကြပြီးတော့ဒါဆုစိုက်ပြီးတော့ရှုမှတ်ကြပြီးလျင်မိမိတို့လိုလားတောင့်တတဲ့ဒုက္ခခတ်သိမ်းချုပ်ငြိမ်းရာကိလေသာချုပ်ငြိမ်းရာဖြစ်တဲ့ငြိမ်းတဲ့နိဗ္ဗာန်ကိုမညာဖူညာဖြင့်လျှင်မြန်လွယ်ကူစွာမျက်မှောက်ပြုနိုင်ကြပါစေလို့ဒါဆန္ဒပြုပါတယ်
So one is to maintain this mindfulness, this thorough mindfulness throughout all of one's actions. So the degree to which, the extent to which one is to maintain this kind of mindfulness is obvious with the final instruction in this section on clear knowing, section on clear awareness, Sampajanya. This final instruction is Uchara Pasawakami Sampajana Karihoti. To make oneself discerning when one is urinating, when one is defecating. So even in the bathroom, one is to develop insight. Even in this action that is hidden away that you don't see, not just when one is not just to practice mindfulness when one is out in full view, but even when one is in the bathroom. So if one thinks about this, it's very clear that if one is to practice even in the bathroom, then there's no area, no place, no action that is not to be an object of mindfulness, no area, no action that is not to be used to develop insight. So it might be a little bit of a problem to give very specific instructions for noting in the bathroom. So instead we can just, the yogis can just note however they feel is appropriate in this area. Bearing in mind that this instruction makes really clear that there is, as an example of the smallest thing, of the makes really clear that there is no area which we are not to use to develop insight. There's no action which we are not to use as an object of mindfulness. So in this way, the Buddha constantly encouraged his disciples to strive on with heedfulness, strive on with care, to maintain this mindfulness with this phrase, apamadena sampadeta, striving on with apamada, striving on with heedfulness or carefulness. So the Buddha kept exhorting his followers in this way, using this phrase all throughout his life, as long as he was alive, all the way until he passed into final nibbana, until he passed into parinibbana. He kept encouraging his followers in this way, apamadena sampadeta, apamadena sampadeta. So, following this encouragement of the Buddha, may we be able to maintain our mindfulness thoroughly and continuously throughout all of the actions that are going on in our lives, all of the actions that we find necessary during the day, throughout our practice. By maintaining the mindfulness thoroughly and continuously in this way, we can cultivate the concentration and develop insight deeper and deeper. So Sayadaw wishes that the yogis may be able to practice in this way, maintaining the mindfulness with all of these various actions. In this way, developing concentration and developing insight, finally to realize your desired goal, our desired goal to realize the end of all suffering, the peace of Nibbana. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.